And we're live.
Cool.
Yeah, do you want to go ahead and play the video and then we'll get going?
Sure, sounds good. Let me play it.
A few years ago, I noticed something weird about filmmaking. After directing hundreds of documentaries and ads, I noticed that if the music I chose didn't fit, everything was ruined. It didn't matter who the talent was, how much time we spent on production design and lighting. The music had to be just right. I started to seriously wonder, why is music so powerful? Why are compressed airwaves at certain frequencies able to influence us so intensely? It just didn't seem very fair. And what is music anyway? So I started to take my curiosity seriously. And as I dug deeper and deeper, I discovered a vast intellectual landscape. There were people who knew a lot. We can call them scientists or researchers or academics or investigators. They were people who took their curiosity so seriously, they were dedicating their lives to it. When I had some questions I couldn't find answers to, I convinced two neuroscientists to join me and my artist friends to visit the San in Botswana. Geneticists have identified some San to have the most divergent, oldest Y chromosome haplogroups, and I was curious about their musical traditions. They were so kind and generous as we listened and asked, observed, and laughed, and wondered together. As our trip was ending, Dr. Jessica Grahn said something I will never forget.
I think essentially we're all mini scientists. We are all trying different things in our lives to then see the effect that they have on us or our well-being or our children. And we like to see that, oh, if I do this, then I feel better. If I eat this way, then my life improves. People are driven by their passions in any life career they choose, and scientists are no different. Really, they just want to know how something works. And I'm really curious about how rhythm works.
Scientists are our designated experts to study the world. And that doesn't mean they don't make mistakes, but it is in the nature of expertise that we trust experts to do jobs for which they are trained, and we are not. But why don't we hear more directly from scientists more often? Every year, hundreds of fictional books are turned into fictional films. As we increase our level of scientific detail, we find amazing blue chip documentaries, YouTube flourishing with all kinds of personalities exploring niche topics, MOOCs paving the way for flipped classrooms of the future. Here in this space is what we want to work on. We want to produce more cinematic lectures, or Cinelects for short, building on the shoulders of Cosmos, Merchants of Doubt, and Tangled Bank Studios. People want to learn, they just don't want to be bored. Let's engage them by transforming static, two-dimensional PowerPoints into dynamic, four-dimensional videos. Cinelects feature investigators explaining their findings in gorgeous films with beautiful cinematography, dynamic animations, increasing brevity and clarity. In a world inundated with noise, let's amplify those with serious curiosity.
Wow, Van, thank you for that. I get chills literally every time.
Oh, come on. I appreciate it.
It's true. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to everyone that's watching this after on YouTube or on another streaming platform. Like much else of our lives, this is brought to you through Zoom. And I just want to say that we're really grateful to everybody that's reached out about the cinematic lecture that we put out with the Interdisciplinary Affective Science Lab and with Creative Flow, or with Flow Creative Studios, I'm sorry, Van. Just now, in the past, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen thousands of views and dozens of folks have reached out and commented on that they found it valuable. So we thought we'd take the time to talk a little bit about how this project came about and what the vision for the future is. And Van, I think you, in that video, articulated beautifully that there's a lot of noise, but there are a lot of people with serious curiosity, and there's a lot of incredible scientific communication work being done, and that we're thrilled to be able to put something into the work that explains Dr. Barrett's theories so clearly, so vividly, with such compelling narrative. So I think we're going to have a discussion for about 2 hours about how this video came about the incredible work that it covers. We'll take questions. We'll have a few folks joining us. We'll be on Twitter. You can ask questions in the comments. But I think most of all, we're really grateful that folks are taking an interest in this right now. It's important work, but like I've been saying kind of in the bottom of all my emails for work, everyone's busy with work and they're busy with things that are much, much more important than work right now. And so we're really grateful for folks that are taking the time to be with us and to think about this. And we hope that everybody that's watching this finds them safe, well, that everyone's taking care, that they had a good week. Happy Friday. Every week is 2 weeks now. Why don't we all add our videos back and we'll talk a little bit about how this project came about. Van, you're joining us somewhere in Saturday right now from the beautiful city of Beijing. Do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are and where you work and what you do?
Sure. Let me just start off again by thanking Joseph for putting all this together and Lisa's great work that just pulled me into all this about what, a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. For me, I was born in Taiwan. I grew up in Chicago. And then about 11 years ago, 12 years ago now, actually, came to Beijing on a National Geographic documentary. And I actually held all this prejudice against China growing up. You can't design a more anti-China person than me, to be honest. Born in Taiwan, grandfather was in Kuomintang, fought against the communists in the Civil War. Dad grew up in the refugee camps, and so I grew up actually with a lot of like anti-Chinese sentiment, and I actually speak the language and know the culture a bit, so it's a little bit more qualified. But I think it speaks again to why it's always important to try to keep an open mind and try to remove your own personal biases. And that's why I ended up actually staying after the project, is because I found myself so wrong on so many things if I took off those blinders. And to kind of skip ahead a couple of years, I was actually sick with the flu about 2.5 years ago when I stumbled on Lisa's TED Talk. And again, that was another case of me disagreeing, but I try to force myself. I looked at that title and this is, how you can control your emotions, right? It was a TED Talk, something like that. And I was like, no way. Like, that's dumb. There's no way you could do that. So I clicked it and I watched it and it just blew my mind. It totally blew my mind. And right after I watched the video, I bought the book. I read the book in like 2 days, and then emailed Lisa and like, this is how a lot of this, got rolling and started. Is there's just a lot of wonderful science out there. And I sometimes joke that I'm a born again science lover. I try to bring that enthusiasm back. I kind of discovered it late in life that science is something that not only informs us with knowledge, but it gives us a way to look at the world, right? It is a way of thinking. It's a way of skeptically, to quote a lot of the great giants before us, right? To skeptically kind of try to understand how the universe actually works. And so it's too late in my life, I think. Well, it's not too late to contribute to science. I think it's too late for me to choose that as my occupation. I've spent so much time kind of building a skill set around storytelling, but I think at the same time, it's a perfect pairing. It's a perfect chance to say, there's already so many great scientists out there with wonderful studies that have been building consensus for so long. And now it's just about building on the shoulders of science communicators, which I hope to do, right? Like HHMI Tangled Bank, which I think they do an amazing job of. If you guys haven't seen Serengeti Rules, you really got to see that. You're in a Fish, hosted by Neil, Dr. Neil is really awesome. And then there's iBiology, there's tons of these, Cosmos, all these wonderful actually documentaries out there that have inspired many of the young scientists that might be watching, or the older ones keeps everybody sustained. And I think the next level is just about adding more detail. I think that's where there's just all this potential, which is instead of starting from scratch every single time, the internet has allowed us to basically skip ahead sometimes Yeah, exactly. We can build on top of what's already there. We don't have to go again. The cell is the most basic unit of the, we don't have to, we don't have to go back to basics. We can actually just start sharing all that really interesting nitty gritty stuff, and pushing that edge forward. And I think iBiology and Wonder Collaborative, they've already done a great job. If you look at those channels, there's just hundreds of wonderful videos out there that go super deep. And then I think the great possibility of Cinelex is that we just add that cinematic component. We just take that wonderful stuff, like How Emotions Are Made, beautiful book. How do we just turn that into a script, right? So comic books get into comic movies. Let's just turn academic books into academic movies. So.
Beautiful. And so Lisa, you get this email from Van Yang. He's just recovered from the flu and he's had this mind-changing experience. I know you get these sorts of emails a lot. People have been writing to you, I think. I only see a small sliver of your inbox, but you're getting dozens a week of folks that are from all walks of life that are just saying this new view on human behavior, on emotion, it's changed the way I think, it's changed the way I live. So what made you think that it would be something that's doable? It's not very often that scientists can take a book and make it into this type of lecture. What is it about the way that you structured the book, the way that the lab pays attention to communication, that made a project like this possible?
Well, I think a project like this is possible mainly because of the players. So right when the book came out, I was receiving hundreds of emails a day, and then it trickled down to, dozens of emails a week, or dozens a day, and then dozens a week. And even now, the book's been out, I guess, 3.5 years, and I'm still receiving emails every day, usually just 2 or 3, amidst everything else. And I was really gratified and extremely grateful that people found it so useful and so compelling. And I think, as you know, Joseph, we receive a lot of invitations to speak at a lot of places and to talk to a lot of people. And I really think that this project was possible, though, because of Van, actually. I mean, I think it was Van's curiosity and his, really you're an incredibly curious person. You like scientific detail. In fact, Van just did the illustrations for my new book, and we were, arm wrestling sometimes over how much detail to put in. And it was really funny because it was me saying, no, we don't need to draw the cerebellum of the brain in that much detail. The reader doesn't need to know. And, you were like, but I want to know. I want to show how this looks, So I think, I guess what I would say is that Van, so I've talked to a lot of filmmakers, a lot of people on podcasts, a lot of journalists, and not everybody is as interested in the details or prepares themselves. I mean, I think Van was really, what interested me was that he was so interested, and he wasn't looking for a canned, pre-digested answer. And sometimes you have to give those answers, and it's okay. I mean, there are different levels of exposition in science, right? So, to scientists, you speak with tremendous detail, and you have to know how to sort of titrate the amount of detail for the audience that you're speaking to. But I think, one thing was just his curiosity was really infectious, and I love people who love science, so that's also fun too. And I guess it's funny. I've traveled a long way in a short amount of time, from 2013, when, if you had asked me, I would have said I will never write a popular science book. That's really not my goal, and I don't you know, I'm happy being in my lab, and I don't see myself as a public intellectual or somebody who brings science to the public. I just don't see that as my role. To, in very short amount of time, not only understanding that it's my role, but I think it's my responsibility, actually. And I don't know, it's just very refreshing to work with someone who wants to bring science to the public in a way that respects both the integrity of the science and the integrity of the public. Like, there's so much that passes for public discourse around science, which is very cartoony and doesn't, I mean, you don't want to bore people, but science entertainment is more than just entertainment. It's more than just being amused. You have to learn something, and you really want to come away feeling like you want to know more. And I think that's really rare. So I think the space that he wanted to inhabit was really rare. And it's a space that I find very, very, very compelling. Also, it doesn't hurt that, you know, our lab, Joseph, is filled with fantastic young scientists who also feel exactly the same way. So that made the whole task, including working with you, you know, made the whole task much, much easier.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, I want to add.
Go ahead.
No, I just want to add something onto that, which is that, you know, I also bought into this kind of floating myth out there that scientists aren't good at explaining things, or they go into too much detail, or they're not creative or something like that. And the moment I started actually meeting scientists, I found that was totally wrong.
Yeah, scientists get like a totally bad rep. I mean, basically, we're like idiots or evil, you know, evil villains in movies. We have like a very bad, we have a very, very bad reputation. I don't know how that happened, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is from film, right? I mean, if you talk about priors and the way that we look at it, it's true. Like, I never had really met many scientists in my life, and then when I, like I said, when I actually met Jessica, I was just like, okay, well, this person is not always in a lab coat. This person is not, you know, like socially inept, right? This person is creative. This person like wants to know about something, and then it finds a lot of different ways to kind of make things happen. And then meeting and talking to you and Joseph and a lot of the, whether they're neuroscientists or they're, you know, they're just academics or they're researchers, whatever it is, you know, part of that I think is, I don't want to say the fault, but the source comes from popular media, right? The source is that, okay, well, if I haven't seen a scientist in my real life, then the one that I see in TV, or the one I see in a movie, or the one I see in a film, that's the one that I think of probably. And so it's just about, I think, just like every other stereotypical barrier, it's just about breaking those things, right? Oh, our gay people are always ditzy, or they're always this or that. Oh, you know, Chinese people are always like this, you know.
Oh, I still get comments from people whenever I give a lecture or a talk and I'm wearing a leather jacket. People are like, "Oh my God."
Oh yeah, that's not allowed.
Yeah,
totally not allowed.
You know, until recently, I didn't even own a tweed jacket. Now, of course, I have several, but they're very fashionable from Glasgow. So.
You go from Glasgow. Yes. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about not just the kind of atmosphere and values that led to making this, but what I see as some of the really crucial innovation and kind of technique that came about in making this. So Lisa, you've kind of innovated this way of explaining the theory. I think psychologists often, they show illusions, they show demonstrations. There's kind of this history of the psychologist as a bit of a showman, right? In public lectures where you might, you know, demonstrate something and kind of trick people a little bit. But you, in that TED Talk that Van mentioned and elsewhere, often blow minds in the crowd. People, you know, we hear these kind of gasps at these moments. Sometimes I'll be taking notes or doing email while I'm at a talk or filming, and then I'll hear it and I'll know what moment it was. And I think I'm wondering what what it was like, developing that as a kind of experiential proof of your work. And then Van, this video has so many of those, and you kind of innovated the whole other set. And we can maybe show a little bit of them, or we can reference at what point in the 40-minute Synelect they are. But that to me is that interactivity, that proof by experience, I think, is a really meta rich, just really cool part of having made this, but also of just consuming it and of seeing people's responses.
Well, when I decided to write this book, the first thing I did was I read about 50 popular science books, seriously. And I analyzed them for the style that they were using. So what was the pedagogical style? What was the story format? Was there an arc? If so, who was the character? And there are a lot of books on writing. So I also read a lot of books on how to write. I mean, I know how to write a scientific paper, I think, by
You've
now.
done what, 230 plus of them? So
something like that. But writing for the public is a whole other whole other can of worms, a whole other, I was going to say ball of fish. I don't know where that came from. But, so I wanted to see how people were doing it, and then try to figure out what my own style was going to be. And there were a couple of things that I discovered. One is that, to my chagrin, data, observations don't convince people as much as their own experience. And we call that naive realism, believing that your experience reveals to you the way things work. But if you understand that people are naive realists, we all are really, then you understand that what you have to give people in order for them to stick with you is an experience that they can chew on, that's really startling to them. And one of the books that I read that I thought was really good at this actually was Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, because the scenarios that they use in their experiments are like little demonstrations of the biases that they were illustrating. So the reader gets to experience those biases. And I thought, wow, that's really a powerful thing to do. And it's particularly important with the work that we do, because much of the work that we do is so unintuitive and it's so not believable. I myself would not believe it if I didn't see the data with my own eyes. I happen to be a person who's very data driven, but even many of my colleagues are not that data driven. I mean, they are data driven as scientists, but really what convinces them, is their own experience. And I had a situation where, for example, I had a friend who was a professor, a psychologist, and, who always gave me such a hard time about the scientific work that we did, was super skeptical, until he got sick. And then I would go see him, every other week. I would make him lunch, and, he ended up passing away. It was very sad. But what was interesting about it was that all of a sudden now the theory, and I use that word, in the scientific sense, meaning a theory isn't just a bunch of ideas, it's a bunch of ideas that are backed up by a shitload of data and supportive evidence. And what convinced him was that the theory was useful to him. It was useful to him. It actually made his life easier while he was progressing through his illness. And that was really meaningful to me. I mean, it was meaningful to me to be with him in that way, but it was also meaningful in the sense that I realized that what I need to do is I need to give people a taste of what it feels like to construct an experience. So that was one thing that I knew that I had to be able to do in talks. You can't, you have to sometimes demonstrate things with experience and not necessarily with data. And then the other thing that I learned is that you have to tell people a story. We are by nature sort of storytelling animals. We like stories with beginnings and middles and ends. We like We like there to be heroes. Unfortunately, if there's a hero, then there also has to be a villain, and maybe some victims. And to trying to tell the story of, you know, how emotions are made, or how a brain works, or how a brain evolved, or whatever, you know, to work. That was going to be tricky to figure out, like, who was going to be the victim and who was going to be the villain. And it would have been easy to make the villain my colleagues who I disagree with, but that wouldn't be very nice. And also, it doesn't actually reflect how I feel about my colleagues, all of them. So I realized the real villain actually was habits of thinking that we have in science and in the public, just ways that we've grown up thinking about science. One of which is essentialism, this idea that that categories of things which are similar, you know, we believe them to have some kind of underlying essence, some kind of shared, unchanging essence that makes them what they are. And that turned out to be a really nice villain for how emotions are made. And even in the present moment, you know, looking at this pandemic and how it's unfolding, essentialist thinking is, again, you know, from my point of view, rearing its ugly head. It also rears its ugly head. Many of the things that you know, inequalities and unfair, you know, things that are unfair, or things that we would like to change about our culture, really come from essentialism. So one of the things I loved about working with Van was that he had an intuitive understanding of this, I think, and that there was a lot of variability is the norm, variation is the norm. It's a theme that runs through all the work that I've written, all the work that we've done as scientists. That was something that Van grasped intuitively. It's also something that I think it comes out intuitively in the lecture, in the cinematic lecture. And it's something that I work hard to sort of demonstrate to people in the talk, so that by the time I get to the end of the talk, it's not a surprise. It seems like obvious by that point. And it's just because of how the examples are, you know, which examples are used, and the kind of experiential journey that you take someone on in a 15-minute talk, like a TED talk, or a 45-minute lecture, or so on.
Yeah. Van, what was it like to have to both like follow the rules of the theory or use the implications of it?
Well, it's not
and
rules. There are no
not the rules,
yeah.
But like the theory suggests that if you have somebody experience something in a certain embodied way, if you have them pay attention to it, if you have them intentionally notice the points of construction, it'll help them understand construction. And I think Van kind of takes that to the next level with all these cinematic techniques in the lecture. Van, what was that like? I'm thinking in particular of the prediction parts where we're looking at like sensory kind of auto completion. But I'm wondering what that was like for you as you're kind of both grasping the theory and trying to communicate it and using the theory in your communication.
Well, I think a big part of it was inspired exactly by all of Lisa's work, like all that homework she did to try to find something to really grab your attention. I still remember watching that TED video, right? I was just like lying in bed, like this, you know. I don't know if you guys do this sometimes. I put my laptop like on its side. Yeah, right. You just put it on its side and you just let it rest and you just kind of watch it. I was just doing that, right? And then there was that part of the lecture of the TED Talk where you have the black and white blobs, right? And I won't ruin it for the people who haven't seen it yet, but you know, when that experience happened, where I realized it, I sat up and the thing, I was like, I stared at the screen and I was like, what the, you know, and I was just like, you know, it just totally knocked me off my I don't know, off my pillow or whatever it was. And so there's a lot, I think there's a lot of things in our lives that we appreciate, right? All these little landmark moments that really change the way we think about something. And I think because of all that homework and groundwork that Lisa did to put that there, it infected me. Then that inspired me when I was, writing the script and the screenplay for this, to look back at all my own notes about all these little things that had always wowed me or I thought were really cool. I love Reddit sometimes, and other times I think it's terrible. But I think, we all love browsing for new things or novel things all the time. I keep a big list of those because, in my daytime work, right, shooting ads or documentaries or whatever, especially ads, brand managers are always looking for that next thing that'll wow people. So I've got like a big list of those things. And one of those that I had just kept in the back of the notebook was called noisy gifs, right? So this was just a phenomenon where you saw something with your eyes and you heard it in your mind, even though there wasn't any sound playing. So that just reminded me, right? So that shock that like Lisa had prepared in that lecture, it just made me associate it back to all these other things that, I guess, is that prediction? Is that like how it works? So when I was writing, I was just digging through everything and then slowly sorting the ones that worked and the ones that didn't. And that's how it ended up, making it into it. And I think a lot of it is, Lisa talked about doing homework and reading and then finding your own style. And I basically did the same thing, right? That was kind of one of the first kind of science heavy projects I did, right? Besides, condom commercials and selling laptops and stuff, you can just take that beauty stuff is actually, it will get easier and easier too. As technology advances and it gets less expensive, the beauty will go up, but it's going to get more and more accessible. So that stuff will get a little bit easier and less cost prohibitive, so that you can apply it to something that you don't expect to make millions or billions of dollars, right? It's less focused on making money and it's more focused on having you watch it. And I think that's I think the exciting potential of Cinelex. It's not just us, right? It's not just the couple of us doing it. I hope lots of creatives and storytellers, and I hope lots of investigators start collaborating together and say, we can do something that's not just introducing the lab. That's not just like, saying 3 sentences about what we do. We can just take the work that we've been doing, or this publication that we've been working on, or this book that's, decades or lifetimes of work, and we can transform those things into something as wonderful as watching what the Kardashians are doing, right? Or watching, why I haven't watched it, but my sister sent me or told me there's like some tiger. I don't know what Tiger King is, but she was saying like there's some tiger documentary that everybody watches. I don't know, but there's tons. Yeah, there's tons.
I will say though that I do think that right now the incentive structure in science doesn't really you don't get credit really for spending time to craft the delivery of the scientific knowledge to the public. So for example, all of the time, you spend a lot of time. There's a lot of preparation, a lot of behind the scenes digestion, a lot of trial and error. And I think it's hard for scientists, particularly young scientists actually, to spend that much time on something that actually isn't going to count towards their promotion and tenure. And that's difficult, I think. So all the work that I do doesn't count. It's something I do just because I think it's important to do. I actually think, the university probably derives some benefit from it, but it actually doesn't count on my, when I'm reporting at the end of the year, all the things that I've done. It doesn't, the number of articles I've written that are not peer reviewed, the lecture that we did, all the talks, public lectures, those things, they're not frowned upon anymore, which they used to be, but they're not, they don't count towards promotion. And even running a lab is a very, time consuming thing. And you only have a certain number of years with which to make an attempt to get tenure and at a university. And tenure is important because it does give you freedom to then ask difficult questions. Or if you're working for a company, there are some companies that do give you some time to spend on things that you find interesting on your own, but mostly you're working towards the bottom line, as you know. So I think one of the things that made it possible for us to do is that we were all doing it because we loved it. But we were also in a position to do that, which I think a lot of people aren't, right? I'm not so young anymore, and my lab is well established, and I have a fantastic collaborator who co-directs the lab with me, Karen Quigley. And you had a vision of something that you really wanted to do, and you basically carved the time and donated the resources. Basically, we all donated the things that we contributed. But my point is that I think, I totally think that what we did, it would be wonderful for more people to do it. I just think that for anyone who's listening who has the capacity to modify the incentive structure, it'd be really, really good to take that really, really seriously. I think once it's made more feasible, I think you will find lots of scientists who would like to do it, and you'll find an audience who wants to hear it.
Yeah, totally agreed. I think the audience is there for sure. And I think part of it is because
it's great.
Yeah, it's really great. And it's really exciting too. And I think people don't even, I think most minds are always looking for something new to like digest and to see.
Here's the thing. I never really understood why do people, why don't people go to a lecture? So some nights you might go to a movie, other nights you might go to a lecture. Why don't people find science is interesting? Why aren't there more? I just couldn't understand. And I think I understand a little bit better now, because the cinematic lecture that we did, in large part because of you, Van, and your team, was just beautiful. It's just beautiful, really. I mean, it's just, I suppose it's entertaining, but what it is it just captivates your attention in a way that I think just someone standing up and kind of talking about the work wouldn't do. And I guess I'm so grateful to have had the chance to do it with you, because that's something I always used to ask myself. Well, why aren't there more scientists and more scholars on television? Why don't people just decide to go to a lecture or, decide to go to a discussion instead of going, why always a movie, or, why can't this be an alternative? And I think what you showed us all actually is that it can.
Well, I think another part of it is just about, you talked about stories in the beginning, right, Lisa? And I think one part of it is that in our modern life, we are spoiled by the quality of stories, right? Maybe not the content, but the quality of it, right? We call it production value. And that's simply just, how nice of equipment are you using? What the people look like? Can you relate to these people? Are you doing something that looks cool, right? Whatever cool means. I think scientists are trying to find out what does sexy mean? What does beautiful mean? What do all these things mean? A lot of it, I think, is just about, the quality that is brought to it. And so I think that's just a very direct possible formula to bring to this body of knowledge, right? And I agree, I agree that why can't we also just go to a lecture if we want to go to a film? And I think the only difference is that perhaps just the pieces haven't come together in the right way for like really high quality these really high quality things to come out. But when they do, look at how successful Blue Planet 2 is, right? Or a lot of National Geographic stuff. It's possible, definitely possible for it to be out there. And I think another thing that's also working in our favor is that there is this, it's called peak content, right? Whether it's Netflix or Apple TV or Disney or CBS or NBC. I mean, there's so many people that are trying to make original content out there, right? Trying to be the next Friends, trying to be the next Big Bang Theory. And a lot of it is starting to look the same because it is the same. And I think, I hope some storytellers will start to realize that right under our noses or right underneath our skin, right, or right within our brains are amazing stories that can be told, right? Real stories that are so interesting. Feynman has this great quote that says, everything is interesting once you go into deep enough, right? And I think that's really, really true, that I never thought about really what emotions were until somebody told me really seriously and really deeply about all the aspects that can make it happen, right? I never thought about how my eyes are absorbing information and then it transmits it through 80 billion neurons and then to this and then through experience and then through, I think the possibility is there. And I think that's why it's a perfect melding of kind of storyteller and scientist. And I think it's actually really important that it's a shoulder-to-shoulder collaboration because the world...
It's only 80 billion neurons if you don't count the cerebellum, which is your favorite brain structure.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my favorite. Thanks. But I loved working with you because I think you also really get that idea of like that push-pull collaboration. It's not my script or my video, and it's not just your work, right? It's kind of us working together to say, how can we take something that's really great and then present it in a really wonderful way? And I think that's the right way for it to go forward, because there's that curse of knowledge that scientists might have of knowing basically everything. And they're also qualified to talk about what's the right way to present something. And I think then the creative brings the blessing of ignorance, right? Or the blessing of enthusiasm to kind of counteract that, to be like, oh, I want to care about this. Let me ask more questions. And then the investigator can kind of push back. And I think that yin yang kind of collab is wonderful.
There is a tradition of arts and science, collaborating in the sense of that you can teach science through the arts. You can use the arts very beneficially to teach basic scientific things, and also science can contribute actually to the generation of creative works. And so, I'm a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and they actually have, I think John Lithgow either does chair this committee, or he used to, but where there's this real dialectic between the arts and the sciences. And I think there's also this thing that happens to scientists as they get older, where they either start, gravitating to questions about the arts or of consciousness. It seems like like once you get to a certain stage in your career, it's like you've got, you sort of get to a certain point and then you start to think, okay, now I'm going to take on a really big question, and then there are some people who try to do both, right? But I think the one thing that I've learned is that from you and from working with some other people as well, is that artistic expression and also just the skill set of this, there's a skill set to artistic expression, I guess I would say. There's a set of, to me, it seems like hidden skills, because I don't have them, but that can bring science alive in this very proximal experiential way that I think is what will actually not just inform people, but actually, create the next generation of scientists. that's what's gonna, think about why, every scientist has a story about why they've become a scientist. You probably have a story about why you became an artist. Joseph is still working on his story. He's not sure what he's going to become. Could be many, many, many things because he knows so much. But, there are these iconic moments that were created that just captured, the sort of interest and kind of curiosity of a whole generation. And we need that again, right? We need, again, something like that. We don't have a, landing on the moon or whatever, to do that now, but we need that. We need that. And we need the brightest minds. Like I sometimes in my family, we're very big superhero fans. And so I look at we watch a lot of superhero movies. My husband loves them. My daughter loves them. So de facto, I love them too. And I do actually. But the point is that when you see this, at the end where they scroll up like all the people who worked on the film, they're like 1,000 people who did this like really creative thing. But I'm thinking to myself, what if you took all of these like incredibly creative people and you brought them and they were working on science instead? What would happen to the world if we, and so that's partly what I think is so valuable about what you're doing too, because, or what we did together, what other people hopefully will do is that it will hopefully, cultivate the next generation of minds who really want to do it too.
And I think people do. And I love that idea of just putting your time into doing something wonderful that will change the world. I think that's actually what there's many of us who are privileged, right? We're privileged enough to have that ambition to say like, okay, there's so many things about my life that are nice and easier. And then I want to kind of push that edge. I want to contribute something. I want to leave something behind, do a legacy of something. I think a lot of people who end up being able to be privileged want to do that. And I think that's just the possibility that's there, and I think the other interesting part is that, I think, again, it comes back down to breaking barriers, right? I think just even 10, 20 years ago, our movies and films and things were still very stereotypical, right? I don't know if you guys do this. Sometimes I go back and I watch old movies I like or TV shows or whatever, right? Yeah, and you watch them and you cringe a little bit. You're just like, ooh.
Sometimes you do.
Yeah, sometimes
they hold up, like.
Yeah, sometimes they hold up. Yeah,
but
absolutely,
sometimes they don't. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of them do, and then a lot of them don't. You're just like, oh, there's like the jock and then the nerd again, right? When the reality is that, it was never like that, and so part of that just comes from caricatures, from us not knowing the world so well, right? I mean, it's the same thing. Like if you've never met someone, I mean, I love the story for myself because my roommate at college and university was from Pakistan, was from Lahore. And so we were very close and we talked about everything. And, I knew that Pakistan was not like some crazy place where everything was always terrible, right? I knew that from one of my closest friends. And then when I was going to go to his wedding, I still had I was just like, okay, but what am I supposed to expect, And so I think it comes back again to personal experience, right? Whether it's something that you write in a book or you put in a TED Talk or you put in a Cinelect, sometimes that personal experience, not sometimes, that personal experience is almost the only thing, right? It's the prior. If you don't have that, you have no idea, right? If you've never been to China, then you'd be like, okay, well, China's either it's full of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or it's full of iPhone factories, or, if you don't know, right? If you've never heard of a place called Henan with 90 million people living in it, right? The size of Mexico, right? You just don't know. You've never heard of it. You've never seen it. You don't understand. Nobody's heard of Wuhan, right? Nobody heard of Wuhan until a couple months ago. And then suddenly now it's on the news and people talk about it. It's like, oh yeah, it's this place with all, but it's such a richly diverse, world.
I will say though that just the scientist in me just wants to sort of point out that while personal experience is really important for communicating scientific findings, and personal experience is also really important for in the context of discovery, you know, where you can observe things. Personal experience doesn't count as evidence that something is true, or, you know, so, you know, scientists have I mean, you know, it's like a lot of, you know, scientists don't agree on a lot of things, but the one thing that scientists, I think, really agree on is that personal experience and anecdotes don't substitute for observations under controlled settings. So I just kind of want to point that out, that I agree with everything that you say.
I'm with you. No, I'm with you.
And I think that the interesting thing about the human brain, and probably about all brains really, is that what counts as evidence for you, like what counts, what you notice in a room and or in an experience, and what you don't, really is determined by you. There are no, you know, independent variables in the world. Your brain is deciding, right? So you could have probably gone to Pakistan and had a very stereotypic experience, depending on how your brain was foraging for information, how your brain, what your brain was treating as data or as evidence, and what it was ignoring as noise, you know?
Right. No, absolutely. I like that word, foraging, actually. That's a nice way to talk about, you know, how your brain is selectively picking, right?
Yeah.
And I think something that people have a big experience of is that essentialism is their main prior. And so when they go through the world, they'll see essentialism everywhere and it'll make sense. I wanted to actually bring somebody onto the chat to ask a question, who I think, like a lot of readers, has had the experience of reading the book and it changing the way that they're able to experience the world. And I think they wanted to ask a question about that. So we're about to hear from Joey Hirsch, who comes to us by way of Austin, Texas. Joey's trained as a mathematician, formerly had a postdoc at MIT at the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute. Let's get him on here.
Awesome.
Cool. Brilliant. Hey, Joey, how are you?
Joey, what's up?
Hey, hi, Van. Hi, Lisa.
Hi there.
Hey, I heard the little bit about essentialism, and that's totally my experience. Not just as an American, but also a mathematician, I feel like I didn't even know I was looking at the world through that lens, and I feel really grateful. I feel like probably every day I wanted to send you an email since I read this book about 3 years ago. So thank you, Lisa. You've changed my intellectual life, but also my personal life. So should I ask my question now?
Yeah, for sure. And feel free to contextualize however is most helpful.
Okay, yeah, I have two questions, but I'll start with my second one since it seems most relevant. So when I was reading How Emotions Are Made, like I couldn't shake the sense that while the object of discussion and study is emotion, like your philosophy was laying out a blueprint for what felt like a totally new paradigm of scientific inquiry. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how construction has changed your philosophy or model of science itself.
Well, I can't, you know, first of all, thank you for noticing that actually it's a blueprint for doing science differently. One of the things that, you know, it seems to me that many of the things I care most about, like philosophy of science and how science should be conducted, and or even how, you know, how does a nervous system work, you know, big questions. I've always approached them, you know, initially through the lens of emotion. So it turns out that it's a great topic for approaching really, really important questions, like what makes you human? What makes you the same as other animals? What makes you different from other animals? What makes you responsible for your behavior? You know, these like big questions that have been around for a really long time, like millennia. It turns out emotion is this great, it's this great vehicle. And it is a vehicle for a blueprint for conducting science. And when I say philosophy of science, that's really what I mean. What I mean is, how is it, what is it that you observe, and how is it that you infer meaning from what you observe? And so I guess what I'll say is, I don't know that constructionism leads me to think about science differently. I think I've always thought about science differently than everyone, not everyone else around me, but than a lot of people around me. And things that make sense to them don't make sense to me, and the things that make sense to me don't make sense to them. I actually wrote a chapter to a book about how an essentialist sees constructionism. Like, why is an essentialist somebody who essentializes just because of how they've been taught, or their natural inclinations for how they think? What they're asking all the wrong questions. When they're asking a constructionist, they're asking all the wrong questions, because they're thinking through their own framework, basically. And so I guess what I would say is I would focus on a couple of things differently. One is that I would focus on variation instead of focusing on, averages. So there are a whole set of statistical and mathematical approaches to data that focus on averages, or that focus on aggregates of the data, as opposed to modeling the variability in the data. And I probably would focus more on that. I think that, scientists have to be very, very, very careful about what is an observation and what is an interpretation. So in a lot of, I don't know how it is in your field, but in psychology and in neuroscience, in biology to some extent, there's rampant confusion, right? Scientists don't always understand. They're not always aware of when they're making inferences. So in emotion, you see it really clearly. People will say, well, there's an inborn innate circuit for fear. And what they mean really is that it's not even clear to me there's an inborn innate circuit for freezing, but let's just say there is. That's a behavior, and it's a behavior that an animal can emit for lots and lots of reasons. And when you call it fear, you're making an inference about what the cause is of the action. And this failure to distinguish between actions and our inferences about actions, and to stipulate things that we then believe we're discovering, but really we're just stipulating them by our inferences, is really a rampant problem in science. And it's something that a constructionist takes really, really, really seriously. That you always realize that the interpretive frame that you're giving to data is just one of many. It's not infinite, the number that you could give, but it's almost always more than one. And there's this really great, we work a lot with engineers now, and for the last couple of years, 7 or 8 years, and there's this, we're learning systems theory. And so basically you formally state what is in a system, and then you try to model inputs to that system and outputs to that system. And one of the things I learned really early on is that where you draw the boundaries of a system, so what's in a system versus what's an input to a system, is all you. It's all you. There's nothing in the natural world that tells you, oh, here's where, like when I was learning neuroanatomy, which was, I came to already, I was a professor, I would often ask great anatomists, I would say, well, when you have one neuron that's modulating another neuron, how do you know if they're in the same circuit, or if it's one neuron from one circuit modulating the neuron from another circuit? And that's really the same question as how do you know if they're both in the same system or if the one's, you know, one is an input to a system? And the answer is you don't. You don't. There's nothing anatomical, there's nothing chemical, there's nothing physical that will tell you. It's all in your mind. And
Yeah.
So just to give you like a really concrete example, you know, for a really long time, people have believed that the way to understand the functional architecture of a brain is that there are mental modules doing different things. So this swath of cortex does this, and that swath of cortex does that, and this, you know, nucleus does this, and so on and so forth. Or now they might get sophisticated and say, okay, this network does this, and this other network does that. But the fact is that the way that neuroimaging studies are designed, they're really, really underpowered. So instead of running, you know, 500 trials where you get a subject to do something 500 times, you might get them to do it like say 50 times. And when you're underpowered, the only activity you're going to see in the brain are in the most robust spots. So it looks like you have these islands of activity, but when you actually run an experiment that's sufficiently powered, which just means you have enough variance that you can see more of what's going on, you see 85% of the brain change its activity just when you're looking at a swath, you know, just when you're looking at an image that has a line going this way or a line going that way. So, but most neuroscientists wouldn't have thought that, wouldn't have discovered the important that you know, seeing even a line is a whole brain event. It's not just happening in one little swath of cortex, because they don't realize how their own assumptions lead them to even design experiments in a particular way. If 50 trials getting somebody to look at a stimulus 50 times and respond 50 times, if that gets you activity in a little blob of cortex and you expect that's what you're expecting to see, then for you, that's good enough, right?
Yeah.
So it is really a very, very, very different way of doing science. It's a really different way of understanding causality. And it's also a different way of understanding, you know, your role as a scientist in, I don't want to say creating what you find, but setting a context to make it easy to find something, to observe some things and harder to observe other things.
Yeah. And I'd love to follow up on that, because that answer felt so alive to me. Like it's something I've been thinking about a lot, especially the open systems approach, like trying to figure out like, okay, like what, you know, is this on the inside or on the outside? And I think, you know, I've had thoughts like that as, you know, as an essentialist too. And like from that perspective, it's like, well, there's different scales, and you can just pick things at different scales, and that's where these things are determined. But from the point of view of construction, it does seem like you can pick your concepts and ask questions in that context, but that there might be competing concepts or non-compatible ways to look at something. And so that like, perhaps like maybe not all ways of asking scientific questions are even compatible with each other. Does that?
For sure. But I think, you know, I would say, yes, I completely agree with you. But I would also say that some ways of looking at a scientific question are more useful than others. So let's take the current situation. You know, one way that I demonstrate to people essentialism, you know, I can define it. I can say, well, you know, a category is a group of things which are similar. And essentialism is believing that the similarity comes from an essence, you know, comes from this unchanging underlying thing that, you know. So I say to people, and they're like, oh, I'm not an essentialist. I mean, basically, calling someone an essentialist, like in science, is like picking up a white glove and slapping them across the face with it. But if you say, how many of you believe that a virus is the cause of a respiratory illness, like a common cold? 99% of the people put their hands up. And then I say, okay, well, there are experiments that place a virus in someone's nose under extremely controlled conditions. And somewhere between 20 and 40% of people develop an infection. that means that a virus is necessary, but not sufficient as a cause of a respiratory disease. There have to be other causes. And when I say other causes, I don't mean moderators, like things that turn up the dial on the likelihood or down. What I mean is that in order for a virus to infect you, your body has to be in a particular condition. It's really the interaction of the virus and your body that produce the infection. And so that means that really what you're dealing with is a complex system. You're not dealing with something where there's like a single, very strong mechanistic cause. You're dealing with you're dealing with a system of weak interacting causes that are probably nonlinear. And that means that you can't really just you can't just really try to understand a virus and then understand infection. You have to also understand the host too. And so what predicts infection in addition to exposure to a virus? Well, it's a whole bunch of psychological things. And so what this means really is that psychological factors are also causes of respiratory illness. You could say that a virus, you could say that a COVID infection, or you could say tuberculosis, or you could say a flu, or you could say a common cold, are as much a psychological illness as they are biological illnesses, because they also have, those factors are also necessary, but not sufficient for infection too, right? But if you just sort of say that right off the bat, if I say to people, well, how many of you think that developing pneumonia is a psychological illness? People will be looking at me like, are you nuts? Right? But it's all about what is your understanding of cause. And I would say right now what we're viewing is the lack, I think the lack of, we're somewhat living, all of us, the consequence of people using a less than optimal understanding of cause. So it's true, we could look at this situation with lots of different causal lenses, lots of different ways of understanding it, but some ways are slightly better than other ways for certain outcomes. That's what I would say. That's my own personal view. And I just wrote a column actually about this issue because I think it's really serious, actually. Like nowhere do we see people in newspapers and in the media talking about the importance of social connection and so on to make you feel better, like emotionally, as if somehow that's divorced from the state of your nervous system and the state of your body. When in fact, there are really good reasons to stay socially connected, to flatten the curve after you've been exposed to a virus, you know? So yeah. That's probably a longer answer than what you wanted, but it is something I'm just thinking a lot about these days. So
I have to admit, it's not quite as long as I wanted, but I would love the answer. Thank you. I'd love to ask one more question. This one's a little bit, I'm trying to get a little bit of a provocative response in a way. In this book and this lecture, you teach that emotion concepts are not perceiver independent, right? That they depend on the perceiver, and that they're not perceiver independent, they're constructed. And I wanted to know, what other concepts you think are floating around in popular discourse or scientific discourse that people talk about like they're perceiver independent, but that you strongly suspect or know to be constructed?
Well, race, stages of development, like what makes someone a child versus an adolescent versus a young adult. I would say, frankly, every psychological construct is, when I say it's constructed, and what I mean is, when I say that, I'm not being derogatory in any way. I mean, I think the psychological categories that we use in Western science are not the categories of mind, not the psychological categories that are used in other psychologies. And in fact, so I think that I mean, the fact that something is socially constructed, like the fact that something is constructed and that it's a category of social reality, meaning all of us are imposing meaning on this physical thing, which it doesn't have by virtue of its physical nature, but we all sort of impose the same function. Like, you know, what's a country? Where are the boundaries of a country? Who gets to be a citizen? What's a citizen of a country? What's a president? What powers does a president have? What counts as currency? I mean, all these things that are very, very functional, that are also categories of social reality. This is also true, I think, in science, and even in biological science. You know, what's the central nervous system and what's the peripheral nervous system? On what physical basis do you make that claim? None is what I'll tell you. So you could think about the brain and the spinal cord as the central nervous system and everything else as the peripheral nervous system, or you could not. And actually, one might be better suited, one way might be better suited than another. You know, I could think about the brain and the body as being a unitary thing, a unitary system. Actually, you know, I could go even further and say, if you and I were in the same room and we knew each other and we liked each other and our nervous systems started to couple, maybe we are a system in that moment, right? And so I guess I would say almost everything. I mean, I don't know enough about physics and chemistry to give a really good answer at that level, although I know those answers, you know, if I had read a little bit, that's a little remote for me at the moment, but I know those answers exist, even at that level of analysis. So to say that all these things are socially constructed doesn't mean, or so they're categories of social reality, that we've constructed them by imposing meaning, doesn't mean that they're not true in some contextual sense. It doesn't mean that, because they are, it doesn't mean they're not useful. It doesn't mean that they that they're unworthy of study. I mean, it sounds like a very radical thing to say, but I think, you know, Naomi Oreskes just wrote this great book called Why Trust Science that that Van highlighted at the beginning. And there's this really great, I love this book. I also have some quibbles maybe with it, but one of the things I love is she lays bare almost immediately the point that there is no absolute truth, really, and that truth in science is really by consensus. But it's the consensus of scientists who determine the reliability of any scientific fact. So individualism can't exist in science and have science function the way it's supposed to. I don't know how much closer you can come than that to saying that the basis of science is rooted in social reality, and that's its strength, not its weakness, right? I mean, I think that's the brilliant maneuver that she maps out in that book. So if you wanted a provocative answer, that's the best I can do off the top of my head.
Thank you. That was great.
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks again for answering my questions. And I've had a really fun time thinking about all these ideas, and it's really enriched my life and the lives of the people around me. So
that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you so much, Joey. Much love to Austin. Be well.
Bye.
Thanks, Joey.
Yeah, be well.
Bye, Van.
Bye-bye.
Be well.
I think one, if you all are open to another listener question, we'll turn to it. I'll just set it up a little bit, which is at the end of the film, Van, maybe we think of this film as having 5 parts. There's that intro section, there's the 3 ingredients, and then there's this, maybe 6 even. And then at the end, there are these 2 parts. One is Lisa answers this melange of questions about places where the theory applies all across our world. And there's also this section about translation and language. And Van, you interviewed a lot of different folks in the community there in Beijing to talk about emotion words and about emotion expression and how it varies culturally. Do you want to chat a little bit about that, about how you had a vision for that part and what it took to film it and kind of get those really, I think, beautiful, kind of vulnerable, honest responses from that group?
Well, I think it actually gels really well with what, Joy was just talking about, perceiver dependent and perceiver independence, because I think a lot of people around the world who are multicultural or multilingual, they know how perceiver dependent the world is, right? How do I even translate a word, right? How do I translate 沉重, right? How does, that Jingyi was saying, how do I translate that? Is it, I don't know, right? So, I mean, it's in the end, you can, with constructionism and constructed emotion, everything finally starts making sense, right? Okay, we create this concept that's anchored perhaps by a word, and then behind it are maybe thousands of predictions. And then your predictions are different than my predictions. And somehow through some kind of consensus, or we kind of slowly agree, that's how something works. And there can be tremendous variability, not only across cultures, but within a culture and across people. There's, I remember when I moved to the States and I first walked into a house and I didn't take off my shoes, right? Like everybody had their shoes on. It was my friend Kevin's house. I know Kevin's not going to be watching this, so I think it's okay if I say, but I went into the house, I was about to take off my shoes, but he ran in, the dog ran in around, right? And that whole house, everybody was wearing shoes, even up to the bed, like everything. And I was almost disgusted. I was like, because that was like my first experience of that.
Were you disgusted, or did you feel like when you keep your shoes on? And okay, so I grew up in a home also that everyone always took their shoes off when they came in.
Yeah.
And now when I go to someone's house and they tell me to keep my shoes on, I feel like I'm doing something wrong.
Really? I don't know. I think that comes back to the cultural context thing, right? So whether it's, Asian cultures or, the house that I grew up in, it's about cleanliness. So it was focused on cleanliness, as in like, maybe you tracked in, not dirt, maybe you tracked in some dog poo, right? It was like that was what I was taught, really. Like you come in and then you have your outside clothes, like you have outside clothes even, right? So not just shoes, but outside clothes.
What's so interesting to me, maybe it's just, I guess what I want to say though is that I think, and of course, I guess it's an empirical question, but the way that you managed to shoot some of those scenes, like I'm sort of intrinsically skeptical of anything being universal, but I do feel like some of the ways you shot those scenes, it doesn't matter. So you're right. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying about context but also I feel like there's something transcendent about how you shot some of those scenes that even if you don't speak the language, some message is coming through, which is funny for me to say that as somebody, but I do feel that way. I mean, I guess I kind of want to say, look, not everything is, not everything is social construction, right? I mean, we can all agree that we can walk through walls, but that won't make it true. Someone could say that you should you should inject yourself with detergent to cure a virus, and that also isn't true. So there are limits, right? But also there are these moments where there is something that seems to transcend culture, that's really ephemeral in a way. As a scientist, I'm curious about what it is. But I wonder if was that on purpose? Were you doing that deliberately, or did it just?
Well, in a way, it's about, in the end, I wanted to also just bring in a way, kind of more evidence, right? Even though it's anecdotal evidence, but I think for many people who have, whether they've traveled around the world or their parents or their friends, you know that there are a lot of things that are dependent on culture. And then there are also things that unite us, right? So I think it's that beautiful balance. And in a way, that's what science is pursuing, right? Investigators are pursuing those things that we can actually describe and they're consistent. And I do think that probably exists for human experience. I mean, one thing is, I'll talk about China specifically because that's the culture I'm most familiar with, but there's this concept of 关系, right? 关系 in English, sometimes they call it, right? And anybody who's like about to go to China or about to interact with a Chinese person or do business in China, you're supposed to know like, oh, there's this special thing in China called 关系, right? And that you have to be very observant of this, right? But in the reality, right, 关系 is just relationships. It literally means relationships. And all it is saying is that it's systemizing that idea. You know, it's like networking and then friendship combined. It's just saying that everybody you know or everything that you talk about will affect the relationships that you have with people, with your boss, with your friends, with your family, all these kind of things. And so it's just systematized. And then, you know, for the film specifically, when we want to talk about emotion, I think it's just about bringing that kind of diversity to it, you know, right? That Olga can have grown up in Ukraine and then have spent so much time in Italy, and then to have, you know, parts of her suppressed and then other things that are kind of promoted up. And then, you know, my friend Laurence, she's amazing because she's just so, you know, she's a drama teacher and like an improv artist. And so she's just always so enthusiastic, talking about everything has to be smile. So I remember, because I did those interviews relatively close to each other, and I was laughing my ass off, right? Because here you have Laurence, and she's like, "Oh yeah, you just gotta smile at people. Like you smile at people, and it's great, and it's a way to connect." And then Olga's just like, "Yeah, you know, you're smiling. Maybe something's wrong with you. Why are you so, you know, smiling?" So
No,
I think it's.
I have more than one friend and more than one student who told me that after their first year they spend in the United States, their cheeks hurt so much from smiling. They've never smiled so much in their whole lives. Actually,
Yeah, totally.
yeah,
Absolutely. And I think that's there. And I think that's just, you know, part of that beauty of human existence, really, to kind of see that there is all this variation in behavior and all this variation in culture, but then we're still all connected by certain, you know,
yeah, affect.
by certain, yeah, by affect for sure. And then by other things. And I think that goes to whether that's philosophy or culture, whatever humanism is, right? I think that's there, and I think it's important to show really that how much variation can be out there. Yeah, it's really fun.
I think we have a question along those lines from Ari, who I think speaks 4 languages, also coming to us by way of Austin, Texas today. Ari, I'm going to ask you to start your video here, if that works. Beautiful. Hey, how are you doing?
Hey, Ari.
Hi, I'm very well. How's everyone on the other line?
Hanging in there.
Good. I'm really enjoying hanging out for this conversation, and I feel so grateful and honored to be invited to participate.
It's great to have you, man.
Yeah, thank you. Really resonating with what you guys are talking about. Coincidentally, Joey and I are good friends, and we read How Emotions Are Made together in a book club with a couple of other close friends of ours who are also tuning into this conversation.
Hey, everybody.
So when Joey says that this book positively impacted him and the people in his life that he's close to, I'm one of those people, and I'll certainly echo that statement by saying that, you know, it's really has impacted me personally as well. So thank you very much, Dr. Barrett. Are you guys ready for a question?
Here we go.
Okay. So I grew up learning a couple different languages over the course of my life, and I've lived in a couple of countries other than the United States. And for me, participating in different cultures and different languages has, as you guys were talking about earlier, has kind of given me a sense of perceiver dependence and a sense of relativism when I think about socially constructed concepts that I'm being exposed to, and seeing different realities in different cultures reinforces that sense for me. And so one thing that I found so liberating about reading How Emotions Are Made is kind of having that idea validated in this kind of scientific context. And one experience that I have is that certain cultures will not have the granularity of vocabulary to describe certain concepts. And you talk about that and How Emotions Are Made as well. So one concept that I'd like to ask you about, Dr. Barrett, is choice. So in How Emotions Are Made, you make the case that free will is an illusion that we experience. You also claim that as adults, we have choices about what we expose ourselves to and how that can then influence our concepts and ultimately our future decisions. And I understand you to be contrasting different instances of this concept of choice, some of which the chooser does not consciously perceive and others they do. And so it seems to me that choice is just lacking the granularity as a concept that is required to use it in a kind of in a functional, like useful way. So I'm wondering if you have suggestions about a different vocabulary that would offer greater granularity for thinking about choice and responsibility as well.
That is a great question, and it's a hard question, actually. It's a really hard question. So I guess what I would say is I haven't really thought about a system of concepts that would bring more granularity. I haven't given that any serious thought, but if I, off the top of my head, what I would say is it seems to me that there are some dimensions that could provide that granularity, right? So one would be there's a temporal dimension, meaning I can do things today that will probabilistically make certain actions more or less likely in the future. So one dimension of control or choice or responsibility is about understanding that basically what your posterior is today is your prior tomorrow. What you do today makes certain things more likely tomorrow and less likely. That actually is a way in which we shape our lives that we're largely unaware of, that if we could get a hold of it, we could pay more attention to it. It could be, you could use it as a way to curate your outcomes in the future. So that's a kind of control. There's also something spatial, right? So certain contexts, your predictions are largely under the control of the context that you're in. In the context, when I say you're in, it's really that your brain is in. So your body is also part of that context. And so we normally don't think about things like sleep and exercise and food as ways of exacting control over our behavior. But in fact, they very much are, particularly sleep and food. Part of what it means to control your behavior and to have more control over your behavior is to architect your environment in a way that makes certain actions more likely or certain actions less likely. So those are ways of expanding the notion of control by adding dimensions that really aren't there. Typically, when people are arguing about free will or how much control they have, they're usually talking about in the moment, and they usually mean, if your brain's going to construct a selection of motor actions that it will choose from, basically. So you can push around those probabilities by with some of these, by making some of these alterations, I guess. And so you could think about choice in that sense. That I think I also think it's important to maybe complexify a little bit the issue of probabilistic outcomes versus deterministic outcomes. So it's very, 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 when people talk about free will, they're usually arguing against strong determinism, a strong deterministic sense, mechanistic sense in which stimulus A will cause action B. And so partly the reason why we don't have free will, we certainly have choice, but we don't have free will. That sounds like an oxymoron until you understand that the brain doesn't work deterministically. It works probabilistically. And there are, I mean, you know, noise, there's noise in the system, and that noise is there for a good reason. It's very adaptive in an evolutionary sense to have things be probabilistic and to have there be a little bit of noise, right? The more variation that you have in the patterns that your brain makes, the more information bearing your brain is. And so that lack of determinism, that, you know, noise in the system, so to speak, is there for a really good reason. But it does create a situation, this kind of paradoxical situation that where you know, your things aren't 100% deterministic, but you do have some control over what you're going to do, sometimes more than others. Sometimes you have more control than others, but you always have that temporal control. Even people who, you know, live in less fortunate circumstances than we do may not have as, you know, not everybody has the same amount of control over their environment, but they have some. And I would say choice has to be, that this kind of control has to be distinguished from responsibility. Responsibility, I think we need some more words for responsibility, like as in the concept of you're responsible and you're blameworthy, you're culpable, versus you're responsible and you're not culpable. Sometimes you're responsible for things not because you caused them or because you are blameworthy for them, but you're responsible for them because there isn't anybody else to change things. Mm-hmm. And so I think, again, I would probably, these are the ways in which I would probably, these are the dimensions. So I would probably take this, what seems like a unidimensional space, and try to blow it up into a multi-dimensional space where we had concepts and words for these different notions. I don't know if that's the best I can do right now without having really thought through it carefully. Yeah, I just, free will to me is just it's just one of those important but really messy discussions, because we actually don't have really good vocabulary, a really granular vocabulary, which it's surprising, right? Given how important it is to everybody. Are there cultures that do? I mean, are there languages that have more granular vocabulary and concepts for this space around control and responsibility and so on?
Yeah, I would love to know that too.
It's an interesting question, right?
What's that?
It's an interesting question.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question.
I can speak only on China, but I mean, I think even me living here, because China, in Chinese, there can be a lot of subtlety to even like the idea of destiny or control or free will or things like that. And I'm not an expert, you know, I've only been here, you know, 10 or so years, but I think, one of them, like you just talked about, blameworthiness or not, right? Culpability or not. And I think, at least in some of the Chinese culture that I know, the idea that you are born into certain circumstances, and whether you're lucky or not to have born into that, I think is also really different than what I grew up with when I was living in Chicago, right? I'll give you an example. In the States, there's this idea that you working really hard is something that is worthy of praise, right? I think in North American culture, that's like, okay, you work hard, then that's good. Like you tried your best. And I can't say this with 100%, but in many interesting conversations I've had in China, the idea that you have to work really hard is sometimes like, oh, you're working really hard. Like, huh. Like, and what I mean by that is, if you were born extra smart and you didn't have to work hard, then that's sometimes more admired. Do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean,
it's very
interesting
weird.
though, oh, sorry, Ari, were you going to say something?
Oh, no.
I think it's interesting though, because what you're talking about is sort of an entity view of, it's like, it is a form of essentialism. It's an entity view of a person, that you're born smart or you're not born smart. And
yeah.
And what's interesting though, I got to tell you, what's interesting is that from a Western psychology standpoint, in Western psychology, there is this entity view of people, that you're this kind of person or that kind of person. You're a smart person, you're not a smart person. And Western psychologists look to the East for less essentialism. So what you're saying is it's there, it's just there in a different guise, really.
What I would say is I would even add to that, right? Which is that at the same time, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, the idea of, it's called keju, right? It's thousands of year old, this meritocracy, I think it's called in English, right? But the idea that anyone from anywhere, for the last couple thousand years, right? Anybody from anywhere can bring themselves from peasant to, like, not aristocrat, but it's the idea of like a prince, right? This educated prince, so this idea that it doesn't matter where you are, if you work hard enough and you're also smart enough in a way, and you're also lucky enough, right? All these three things combined, you can become this kind of this gentleman, right? This idea that you can be qualified to work in the government, or you can be respected enough. And so it's a weird balance, right?
Yeah, so this though is where I start to, I guess, I've never really been a fan of the self-determination, even though if you look at my life, people could look at my life and say, oh, the self-determination narrative fits perfectly for her life. I grew up very poor, put myself through school, worked 2 jobs, so on and so forth. But I would say there are all sorts of hidden things that influence my path. Like I don't have a lot of melanin in my skin. I don't have dark skin. Granted, I grew up in Canada. Things were, when I was growing up there, the issues around race were not so much there, around whether you were of African descent or European descent. It was more like, were you of English European descent, or were you of French European descent? Or were you, indigenous, in which case, you were victimized by the settlers. But, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. What I mean is that if I was growing up on a native reserve, which is what they were called when I lived in Canada, the opportunities that I would have to make something of myself would be really different. Like in this country, there's been this like recent discussion about white privilege, but white privilege is so pervasive, we don't even notice it when it's there. I mean, the things that we just take for granted as normal life are not normal life for other people. And so I guess I would say, the any kind of self-determination narrative assumes an even playing field for everybody. And that even playing field is not there. It's not there. And even me being who I am, if I had been born 50 years earlier or 30 years earlier, you know, the fact that I am a woman, the fact that you know, I'm of Jewish descent, the fact that, you know, that I grew up, you know, struggling in poverty, those things would have been very much determined my life in ways that those things so much didn't determine my life, you know, in this era. So I guess when I talk about, that's why I was saying, you know, when I'm talking about people having more choice or more control, it's always conditional on these sort of hidden influences. And while I think the name of the name of this concept that that you were talking about, Van, that you can become the educated prince. What's the name of that concept again?
Well, it's a system. It's called could you.
It's
right?
a system.
It's like,
could you?
Yeah.
Could you?
Right.
Yeah. Or, you know, these sort of the self-determination story and, you know, the American dream. They're useful, but they're also stories. They're also stories. I just say, to answer your question, Ari, there are some concepts, right, that do distinguish between like blameworthiness and like culpability and responsibility, right, in the legal circumstance, like in the law. But that's usually with respect to harm and intent. And right. So in that narrow sense, there is a vocabulary and there are a set of concepts, but they haven't really percolated out to the general public.
Yeah, I have the sense that that sort of self-starting narrative is a little bit recursive in its meaning. Like, it seems to me that people that are the strongest advocates of that are someone who've had a success with that. And
I would say they've had a success, but they probably also don't realize how much they're focusing on the things that they did, and they should be proud of themselves for the things that they did, but they're also probably not noticing the invisible things that weren't barriers for them that would be barriers for someone else. You know, it's kind of like that, well, you know, what do your taxes really do for you? Well, they paved roads. I mean, you know, they you know, there's this really funny Monty Python sketch where it's in The Life of Brian where, you know, there's a group and they're bitching and moaning about the Romans. And what did the Romans ever do for us? Well, you know, sanitation, right, sanitation, but what did the Romans ever do for us? Well, you know, roads and, you know, schools and health, you know, healthcare, right, roads and schools and healthcare and sanitation, but what did the Romans ever do for us? And I sometimes, when I hear people bitch and moan about paying taxes, I think, well, yeah, well, what do your taxes do for you? I don't know, pave roads, you know, pay the police, like, you know, make sure you live in a safe place, you know, like just all of these things, which are the backdrops that you don't think about how those things matter to your success until they're removed.
Yeah.
Right. That your success, your self-determination is conditional on a whole slew of things that some people have and other people really don't.
Totally. And I think it's, you know, it's like sometimes it's not realizing, and sometimes I think it's actually denying, because that invalidates the sense of accomplishment. Yeah, like what you're saying totally resonates for me, though. I think a way that I've heard it phrased that I liked a lot is that you can feel the wind on your face a lot easier than the wind on your back.
That's a great saying.
That's a good one.
Yeah. That sums it up perfectly.
Thank you so much, Ari. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Ari.
For what you guys are doing, and thanks for a lovely conversation. I look forward to catching the rest of it on YouTube.
Take care.
Thank you.
Right on.
much continued love to Austin. I'd like to bring on one more question and then we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for this. This was really a pleasure. Van, remind us what time it is for you.
Poor sweetie.
It's all right. It's 3 a.m., but you know,
God.
this happens sometimes.
Oh,
It's all good.
You're killing it. This is going to be someone that's familiar to you, Lisa. I'm excited. How are we doing, Kelly?
We are good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, beautiful.
Hey, honey.
Hi.
How are ya?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I know you're crunched for time as well, but for folks that don't know, so Kelly, among many things, is a really talented filmmaker that's part of a group called Playground of Empathy that we have an ongoing collaboration with at the Interdisciplinary Affective Science Lab. And Kelly, you had a quick question about the video, if I have it right.
Yeah. So I'll just introduce myself really quickly. My name's Kelly, as you said, and I've been a filmmaker for a long time, and more recently, I'm a immersive designer. I make immersive experiences with Playground of Empathy, and I've been really inspired by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett and how emotions are made, and then also more recently by Van Yang and your film work. And as an artist, I'm always thinking about how to really burst out of the box and use a foundation of science to create films and immersive experiences that are designed with intentionality and allow people to be the captain of their own emotional journey. And I feel like this really resonates, and it really resonated for me in watching your video, Van Yang, on how emotions are made. And I was wondering if the two of you could talk about the process for making that film.
Sure. Do you want me to start, Lisa? Yeah, well, I'll start then. Kelly, thanks so much for the question. And Lisa, Joseph actually sent me some of the Playground Empathy stuff recently, so I was looking through that. So it's amazing what you guys are doing, and absolutely. And I think to talk about the process a little bit, in my view, it starts. I think it starts with the investigator, right? It starts with some. I don't want to call it a truth about the world, but I would say, you know, some strong observations about how the world works. And I think what the storyteller does is it meets that knowledge with that narrative. And so for me, I think a really great way to think about Cinelex first is shoulder to shoulder, right? So it's not about it belonging to one person or the other. It's not as strict as the film world is, as you know. It's much more about like the shoulder to shoulder collaboration of the creative and the investigator. And so at least when we put together this Cinelect, it started with the book. And then from the book, I think I did about like 3 or 4 different versions of the screenplay. And that's because I kept getting a lot of the details wrong. And I think that's good. I think that's actually really healthy.
Let's just say it was collaborative. It was Joseph and you, and then me coming in and making many changes because I'm unable to ever look at a document without changing it, even my own work. So
I think that's good. And I think that's really good because in a way it's the creative coming to try to explore all the things in different ways, right? Perhaps novel ways like the noisy GIF stuff, or how to talk about affect and how to bring different things in. So I think the foundation is always going to be the work, and then the screenplay is kind of like this essence of it, and you try to draw the most interesting parts of it out, and then from that screenplay, once that gets approved, then it goes to the next stage of storyboarding it out and trying to make sure that it works within your budget, it works within your scheduling, and then because of those limitations, you adjust even more. One little trick I really enjoy doing that I borrowed from my ad work is having strong voiceovers. And what that does is actually it saves a lot of time. You know, most people in the world are not professional actors, and they don't need to be. And even professional actors take multiple takes to talk to camera in a way that's very compelling. That's what the script talks about, and captures it all in a great way. And I think when you minimize that, you save a lot of time in principal photography. So if you're, through all the Cinelects that you'll probably do in the future, or anything that you're trying to do, I think that's something to consider, is that you can just take that script, you can distill it down into those maybe 8 scenes that you want the investigator to appear on screen and to talk directly to the audience and express what they think. And the rest of it, just let it be read, and that saves so much time. That cuts the production time down by, I think, by 60%, in my opinion. And then the rest of it is just like any other film that you've probably made. I haven't seen anything you've done, but you probably have a really intuitive grasp of where it needs animations, where it can film this, what kind of principal talent need to be involved, what kind of scenes need to be there, all those different kind of things. So everything else is pretty standard. But I think,
don't you think though, Van, that there really isn't, there's not really an essence to the story, because we could have told the story in a couple of different ways, probably. And
yeah, totally. Yeah.
As a story, this is, I mean, you sort of think about, first of all, there's a lot about the book that's not in the cinematic lecture. So there were decisions made about what to put in and what not to put in, but there are a lot of, you can tell it, even exactly the same story, you can tell that story in a lot of different ways to highlight different aspects or bring people to different experiences, even in a different order. And so in a way, what's interesting, I think, is that what Kelly and the rest of the folks in Playground of Empathy are doing is a little bit what you could describe it also in what you were doing. Like when you say, well, it's intuitive which scenes to show or what have you. It's intuitive in the sense that you have in mind a kind of experience that you want people to have. And so maybe that's what it starts with. It starts with putting yourself in the shoes of the observer, of the experiencer, and asking, well, what do I want that person to experience? Like, where do I want them to be when they are done? Where do I want them to start? Where do I want them to be when they're done? What do I want that journey to feel like for them? Instead of, as a speaker, you have a choice. You can tell people what you want them to know, or you can try to meet them where they are, where you think they are, right? And you can sort of tell them what you think they need to hear to give them the experience you want them to have. Those are, those are different approaches to telling a story, I think.
Absolutely. And I think every director and every creator will also look at that same material and have their own interpretation and their own life experience and their own take on it, for sure.
Well, Michel Duchamp, right? Didn't he say, Duchamp said, what's it called? The beholder's share, right? Half the artwork is in the observer's brain or the observer's mind.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really insightful into the process and a very helpful tip in making Cinelects.
Yeah, and I look forward to you guys are probably going to make awesome Cinelects too. And I think also the cool thing about Playground Empathy is you're bringing those, if I remember correctly, it started with escape rooms, right? But then from escape rooms, about building those environments where someone can actually have those experiences. In a way, it's that next level, right? I think Cinelects are a deeper introduction to something, and then to have playgrounds of empathy to bring them to that next level, it's that added dimension into it. So you can almost think of it as like this introduction into that full life that you guys are doing. So I only just brushed what you guys are up to, but it sounds like it's awesome.
That's okay. This isn't the focus. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for answering my question.
Good to see you.
Right on.
Good to see you.
Good to meet you, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Looking forward to chatting. Have a good call. And thank you to everyone that watched. Thank you to Lisa and Van for your time. I know, it's always a gift to be able to hear y'all engage so richly. And it's been a joy of my professional and personal life to get to work on something like this that's clearly impacting so many people's lives. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Imagine we'll get some demand to do something like this again soon. So I'm sure this won't be the last live stream.
Just when we have a public forum, I just want to thank them for reaching out, for spending so much time thinking about the project and the book and the science, and for producing like an absolutely just breathtakingly effective and beautiful lecture on the science that I and Joseph and the rest of the lab spend a lot of time doing. It's a gift. It's really a gift. It's a gift that I can't quite express. I'll never stop being expressing my gratitude to you for thinking of this and taking it up, and I hope it inspires other people to do the same.
Well, I just want to throw it right back at you, because I mean, as you can see from the, thousands of emails that you get and all the lives that you've changed, it's definitely, the kind of critical eye that you've brought to this domain of knowledge has really helped a lot of people not only understand their lives, but improve their lives. So I think it's also my pleasure to help share it. And and there's just so many other things and so many other domains of knowledge where this can happen. And I hope that not only are a lot of other scientists inspired to kind of follow in, to kind of be inspired to also share their work and to also put so much thought into their work and sharing it publicly like you've done. But I also hope creatives, just like what Kelly talked about, will also be inspired to work on that. Yeah. Because, there's just so much, there's so many creative people out there who are looking for something interesting to do, right? They're looking for an interesting project, and the source material is there. It's so interesting. There's just so much that we don't know too. And so hopefully we can all work together, and with the help of all the amazing coordination Joseph also does, to kind of bring something, fresh, catalyze something more to happen.
I think there are at least 3 more Synalects in how emotions are made. And that's not
even for sure
about the new book, right? 70 lessons about the brain.
Yeah, for sure.
14 and a half Synalects for sure. Yeah, and I would say to anybody that's interested in the science, that's interested in the science communication, we put our Twitter tags underneath our names in this Zoom. We're on the internet. You know how to reach us. Jump in. The water feels great. And we hope that everyone's taking care. This too shall pass. And yeah, just really looking forward to continuing this work with y'all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joseph. Take care.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Take care, everybody.
Sleep.
Bye. All right. Have a good day, guys. Bye.
Good night.